Okay. Morning. Ciao Michele, good morning.
Good morning, Mario.
We're waiting for the others, and we will wait a couple of minutes more. We are waiting also for Alberto Pirni, who will introduce this session. Did you experience any problem with the learning test yesterday? No? Okay. Good. I see Eugenia, I see Alberto Pirni, good morning.
Hi, everyone.
Ciao. What do you think, Alberto? Shall we start? We can start recording. Okay. Good morning, Alessandra. Ciao. So let me then give the floor to Alberto Pirni, the coordinator of the curriculum number 4. He will introduce this webinar, and the floor is yours, Alberto.
Good morning, Mario, and good morning to everyone. I'm really glad to be here and to welcome every one of you to this last event of a very interesting series of MD workshop that we organized together with the colleagues in the National Coordination Board, but also in a very important and authentic cooperation with the other colleagues in our curriculum, the curriculum number 4. So let me welcome every one of you also by sharing my presentation. Please just tell me if it's feasible to see it in an appropriate way.
We see it very well. Yes.
Okay. Just give me a second, because I noticed a slight problem in visualizing my presentation, and now I'm trying to fix it. Tell me if now it's better, or at least is good.
Everything seems okay. You can do the preview mode if you want.
Okay, I will. Here you are. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Welcome again. And This is the MD workshop devoted to the curriculum number 4, Theories, Institutions, and Cultures of Ecological Transition. And this is, let's say, the picture and a sort of preliminary framing of the entire day. So the journey that we would like to do together with you along this day. We will start with a very brief introduction. We are already in that event, that moment. Then we will go further by hosting the contribution coming with colleagues of the belonging to the philosophical area. We gave to that contribution a title, for each contribution a single title. So the COP26 and the intergenerational approach, theories and methods. Then we will go further by hosting the contribution coming from the colleague, Professor Spinozzi, belonging to the literary theory area. Do a specific occurrence, the colleague Mantuan, which is actually belonging to the philosophical area, we will speak later on, so is now inserted in this second slot. Then we will have a pause in order to relaunch our conversation in the afternoon by hosting colleagues coming and belonging to the legal area. And that's the one that you can see on the screen is the title, Regulating the Ecological Transition. And we will go to the conclusion by hosting Professor Padovan, who will speak in charge of the entire sociological area of our curriculum, along that by developing and addressing that title and topics, so investigating socio-ecological transition theories aimed to cope with climate change. At the very end, we will host a final and conclusive remarks by our coordinator, Mario Martina, who is here. As you have understood from the title, we decided to have a unique focus. Actually, that focus was, in a sense, asked and was, in a sense, promoted and requested by the colleagues. So to have an idea of what the COP26 did and what the COP26 did in terms of relaunching a systemic challenge, which is the challenge devoted to the multifaceted idea and the event of the climate change, and we will try.
他以前是跟着这个郑教授读博士和硕士的。
I will unmute everybody.
他好像本硕博都是在这儿读的。
You need to unmute yourself. You unmute yourself and then you can speak.
Thanks. Well, I was saying that now it's fine, no? Mario, I can go further, okay? Okay, yes. Thanks. I was just saying that we decided together with the colleagues to give voice to a massive systemic point of novelty, which is represented by the COP26, but we don't want to limit our attention to the COP26. We will, in a sense, use COP26 as a way for entering into our main research topics. And this will be evident starting from the next slide, if I try to do that. This slide that describes the topics as a sort of a preliminary list of topics that will be addressed during the first lot. The main topics are addressed by the philosophical colleagues, a philosophical area, and the colleagues belonging to that area. So the COP26 and the youth, framing the concept of intergenerational justice and transgenerationality. How should now the new generations reconceptualize the very idea of nature and the relationship between nature and techniques, nature and technologies, to conclude with a creative responses to sustainability challenges, theories and practice. This belongs to another branch of the philosophical area, mainly the aesthetiological and theories of languages analysis. We'll perhaps move that slot, that last slot, after the following one that you can see from this slide. This is the slide devoted to the area of literary studies and the ecological humanities and eco-criticism for sustainable environment is the comprehensive title. Professor Paola Spinozzi will be with us for presenting the topics that you can see. So mainly three topics: the ecological humanities, the very meaning of the ecological humanity, eco-criticism, sustainable studies, and utopian studies as part of this comprehensive challenge. The climate change and the COP26 article on BBC News are linguistic analysis and theoretical analysis of what happened in terms of also being communicated, to conclude with the eco-poetry in the news. So to say how the young can be active part and actors of that process and that challenge, how this experience might be, let's say, conceptualized along different branches in philosophy, and how this experience might be, if I may express myself in those terms, sublimated into new perspectives. Going further, we will have in the afternoon, starting from 3 o'clock, the legal area, and the main umbrella under which the 4 colleagues will introduce their own speeches is that one that you can read from the slide. So regulating the ecological transition, the European Green Deal, the investment pillar of the European Green Deal, the EU Action Plan on Sustainable Growth, to go further with the focus on climate change and the risk on the insurance sector, in order to conclude with a new wave of climate change litigation that we know as one of the most promising sectors and rising sectors in that area of study. We will conclude then, after having understood how the regulation of new instruments devoted at fostering or contrasting negative effects coming from the climate change and sustainable development might raise, we will see alternatives modalities. So to say, okay, COP26 gave to us, to every one of us, some methods, some ideas, some stimuli for raising a new forms of reflection, but this is not enough. So after and beyond the COP26 scenarios and perspectives, different relationship between climate and society, to conclude with a new reshaping of some of the main important keywords of every social ecological language, like change, transition, and transformation. This will be, together with the contribution coming from theories of ecological transition, this will be the contribution that the sociological area will offer to every one of us, starting from the words by Professor W. Padova. That's the journey that we are going to lead together, hoping that this will contribute effectively to the entire picture that our PhD is offering to everyone. So let me dismiss my cup of the coordinator and address my cup of one of the colleagues within this curriculum to introduce the first nucleo. This is a sort of preliminary outline of my very brief presentation. We will present the very idea of a COP. It is a COP. By virtue, another colleague already addressed that topic on the second day. So we are lucky to see that, okay, a lot of work has already been done. The COP and the youth for climate, I will just give you a couple of pictures related to that. And the main part of my presentation should be devoted to the theoretical issue that I'm addressing, and people working in moral philosophy or global ethics, according to the way to which I am trying to interpret that discipline is working on. So addressing the systemic question of justice among generation, and we will offer a very synthetic and preliminary frame. Well, what is a COP? Basically, a COP is an acronym for saying conference of the parties, and this is a recurring year by year recurring conference promoted by the United Nations. In order to speak appropriately about the COP, we might address three inescapable milestones. We don't have time now in this moment to enter in depth along these three elements, but just let me mention in order to see, okay, we have to address those topics in order to be acquainted, to be aware of what is at stake when we started speaking about the topic. So the UNFCCC, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, signed in Rio de Janeiro, 1992, the Kyoto Protocol, 1996, and the Paris Agreement, 2005. In the following slides, you will find out sort of a very, very preliminary framing of those pillars and basic elements. I don't want to enter into details now. If you have time or you have some specific interest, we can also enter in those details during after my presentation, the presentation of the colleagues. UNFCCC was signed by 144 states and has established a secretariat in Bonn. And this is the sort of the first concrete milestone devoted to a concrete commitment of the United Nations towards climate issues, which is a very concrete, so physical institutions that was grounded in 1994. Among the other elements, one of the overarching aim is provided in Article 2 of the rule that established this conference. And among the key principles, at least two should be mentioned at this level. So the intergenerational and the intragenerational equity approach, and establishment of the so-called right to sustainable development, which has very important implications for all. According to that, and beside that, another very important point is actually a twofold focal point, meaning a mitigation versus adaptation approach, who will remain as one of the key process and a key double point of reference for the entire policies, grids, and articulation and frameworks from that moment onwards. What about the Kyoto Protocol? Well, again, the colleague were already addressed this topic, and I don't want to stress or to waste our time in rephrasing that point. You can see by yourself in the slide. The establishment of specific targets was the real point of novelty, but the target was not so binding, not so concrete. In that stance, the Paris Agreement was and is a point of advancement in those arguments, meaning the Paris Agreement established a legally binding international treaty on climate change. The idea of a 1.5 Celsius grade was established in that protocol, in that agreement, and this is a landmark in the multilateral climate change process, because for the first time, a binding agreement brings all nations into common cause to undertake ambitious efforts to combat climate change and adapt to its effects. We will see how it works, or perhaps also colleagues, we will see that, but please let me mention that also legal colleagues are expert in such a kind of environment, meaning the idea of having to do with protocols and the role of state actors. The idea of reduce the greenhouse gas emission was launched by the Glasgow meeting, so the COP26. But in which sense Glasgow was, in a sense, symbolic or poetic, but in another sense, very important moment for we all. Well, the COP26 will be organized in cooperation with Italy, by the way, for the first time by our country. was established in Glasgow, hometown of James Watt, inventor of the steam engine. So in a sense, it was symbolic to say, okay, Glasgow was historically one of the triggering point of the indirect historically contributors to the establishment of a point of novelty in terms of emission, in terms of waste, in terms of a lot of problems, but also a lot of possibilities in terms of development. This is why we can select Glasgow as the locus, the place in which we can try to start again, start for a new avenue for our near future. By the way, let me just mention that I was honored to be part of the institutional delegation that my own university, sometimes School of Advanced Studies, had the possibility to send to Glasgow. And in this sense, I'm also glad to say that in this curriculum, in the curriculum number 4, beside who is speaking, Professor Barbara Pozzo was part of another delegation coming from her university and other very important knowledge institutions, was part of another delegation, and we were both at Glasgow. This is to say that we are also at your disposal in order to, let's say, refresh the memory also or to share more precise contents related to that experience. And in this sense, in the following slide, I collected a series of pictures just to, let's say, to share the flavor of what Glasgow conferences gave to me as a participant for the first time, and I'm sure to everyone. Welcome to Glasgow. This was the gate of the train station, and this was the tunnel of a ScotRail. A lot of let's say a lot of advertisement to see we are doing something, we are trying to do something, we are aware of the point of novelty. Up to the New York Times first page, we can change the story of climate change, but the history was in a sense different, or also let's say to be framed within a very specific historical way. So the protocol against COVID was really strict, and we had to do a flu natural test every day in order to enter to the conference, just to mention this in little detail. These are pictures taken from the very entrance gates, the very official label. Welcome to the UN Climate Change Conference UK 2021 in partnership with Italy. In partnership with Italy was the label inserted in every form of advertisement, official communication, and so on and so forth. But beside that official moments, well, we will see also from the first day some point of skepticism. Already something was not so good. These are the pictures taken from the main entrance and for the control, pictures taken from the internal events. And this is our 3 pictures coming from the main screen, in which you were acquainted about some of the events that were running in a very limited frame of time. So in 2 hours, you will have 30 up to 40 events that were collapsing, or let's say dealing in contemporary times. This is just to give to you an idea about the complexity, and this is just to give to you an idea on the negotiation rooms. I selected, not by chance, 2 pictures related to the Youth for Climate conference. One of those of the group of conference related to Youth for Climate event. Perhaps you can acknowledge in the TV or in the screen the face of Mrs. Espinosa, which is the UN Secretary General. And also our Minister Cingolani was there, sat down beside her. And this is another picture taken from the same event, which was coming from representative of a lot of young people, young association, NGOs all over the world, coming from all over the world. These are another series of negotiation rooms, just to give up to you an idea of what happened in that moment. But of course, this is not all, and this is not enough for giving a complete image of what happened. And this is just a very, very brief synopsis. caused by looking at my watch, I would like to give to you a very basic idea about the political achievements devoted to COP. Well, I would say that we might see that this was the outcome was a sort of divergent of the comprehensive award. So a final shared sentiment of dissatisfaction came from several sources. So possible motivation of this comprehensive sentiment of dissatisfaction. So an old-fashioned modality for the negotiate, a very answered way, the classical way in which you are asked, all parties were asked to intervene on drafts. So entire meetings devoted to modify a single phrase or a single passage, a single paragraph, and nothing more than this. And this is, in a sense, frustrating. So the second, the perception of strong objective urgency that parties appear as not to be able to translate it into clear decisions. So we have a big urgency, and you are cheating. You are cheating. You are losing and wasting our time, which is a very limited resource. So a strong push from what Jürgen Habermas might call the weak but global public sphere, as compared to the strong public sphere that was, in a sense, in difficulties to translate those pushes into concrete protocols. But then, beside the COP, the Greta movement, so the young movements that gave a lot of communication related to that, and this was just a sort of rhetoric resolve. We may discuss it on that, but I'm completely not convinced that it was just a rhetoric resolve. They gave a very systemic and triggering impulse to the entire global, to the comprehensive global awareness related to those topics. Other forms of dissatisfaction, well, the cancel culture coming from the firmas, but this is a topic that also already yesterday you touched upon, so I don't want now to stay on that, but there were other, let's say, public or private actors that say, okay, we are going to be canceled from the market and we don't know why. We don't have time for replace or re-articulate our main goal as firms are big economic actors. But a big but should be put into the center of our attention. Well, to look in the glass as for at least for a part as a full, we might say that this COP was a point of completely novelty in terms of giving a massive results in terms of communication. Every day, every new news or journal or whatever reported a point, the point of advancement, a sort of a wrap up of the day in Glasgow. And this was the first time, as no precedents for the previous COPs. Then the second point of novelty is a record-breaking number of delegates gathered in Glasgow for this critical COP. We were more than 40,000 delegates. Let's imagine that the first COP were frequented by hundreds of delegates. Then a point of no return, completely beyond the time of bilateral and multilateral agreements in order to create a comprehensive global forms of binding agreements and binding protocols. The establishment of this Paris rulebook, because the Paris Agreement was a very important point of novelty, but we missed the way through which we can give actuality, we can give concrete reality to those protocols, and Glasgow came for solving that issues. Then, last but not least, since also unfortunately, through COVID, this COP was initially scheduled for the 2020, but thanks to this, let's say, postponing, at the end of the day, the COP26 gave more than 50 official decisions, binding decisions. This is a very important result. The most high results in terms of public protocols approved in that case. And last but not least, the Glasgow Climate Pact which is a convergent agreement about keeping the 1.5 recessive grade threshold alive. And this is these are the words to which, according to which the COP26 President Alok Sharma concluded the conference. We can now say with credibility that we have kept 1.5 degrees alive, but its pulse is weak, and it will only survive if we keep our promises and translate commitments into rapid action. I'm grateful to the UNFCCC for working with us to deliver a successful COP26. So a point of, let's say, not full satisfaction or satisfactory results, but a point for a new departure. Well, just to conclude with this preliminary framing that will be used and will be interpreted by all of the colleagues that are going to take the floor after me, there are four main results that are in front of we all are in front of the worldwide public opinion: adaptation, finance, emissions, and the finalization of the guidelines for the full implementation of the Paris Agreement. I can't enter now into details. I'm sure that other details will be shared and will be part of our conversation along the entire day. In that slide, the participants to this meeting will find out the complete list of decisions and their correlative texts for any kind of development or further curiosity. These are the four pillars of the achievement, the four main achievement evenings that COP26 raised: mitigation, adaptation, finance, and collaboration. Youth for climate, then. Well, what about youth for climate? Driving ambition, this was the label according to which that event was launched in Milan, and we as Italian, so our country was one of the absolute protagonists of that moment. The first, this event, this seminal event took place in Milan under the patronage of our Ministry for the Ecological Transition, and this was part of a point of recurring commitment. So our ministry is saying, okay, we are going to save money for allowing young for climate actions and the protocols to be followed and to be part of the next COPs, in order to say, okay, we know, we actors, we parties, we know that you young generations are and should be part of the decision that we are going to take. Please let us know what you mean, which are your expectations, your contributions, your major topics and themes. And this slide resume those themes by saying, by mentioning young driving ambition, sustainable recovery, non-state actors engagement, climate conscious society, and this is really the very. This might seem very minimal, but at the very end, this is a very seminal results coming from this comprehensive event. Okay, that is a sort of a preliminary framing of the issue, and this is will serve as a sort of main umbrella for we all. Let me just use now very few minutes for describing what we can do, what we as philosophers can do starting from that protocols or that agenda. And of course, we started talking on that before the coming COP26. And beside the COP26, we were trying to address a systemic question related to justice and justice among generations. Well, in the meantime, as soon as I enter into this point, let me also anticipate that we decided together with the colleagues to have this kind of behavior, let's say this kind of procedural rules. at the very end of each block, meaning my speech, the speech of Professor Andina, and the speech of Professor Andina after me, and Professor Fasoli after Professor Andina, we will have not a pause, but the possibility to raise a Q&A section in order to share with you ideas and also any other kind of intervention coming from you. Then we will go further with Professor Spinozzi and Professor Mantuan in order to leave the floor to you again at the end of their intervention. This is as a comprehensive idea for going ahead during this moment, during the entire day, actually. Okay, as soon as we start dealing with the idea of justice towards future generations or among generations, we have to address a basic issue devoted to the living togetherness. And articulating a question of justice means having in mind who is responsible or might be able to do something. Why? So what are the specific reasons, the specific motivational driving to which you can do, you decide for doing or you decide for avoiding doing, how, what types of signal of systemic change should we expect, and when. So the timing is not a detail, but it is the very core of our expectation, of our comprehensive attention. So are we about to experience the effects of significant social impact of climate change, or will be the next one, or the next generation to do so? And this is to say that starting from these very, very preliminary protocols devoted to justice, then we have to specify the question of justice. And philosophers, basically, well, moral philosophers or political philosophers basically do that. So they try to enter into the specificity of at least one, we might say, of those points. So the idea of the realization of a balance or an equilibrium in vectors in order to distribute or redistribute resources, pros and cons, the possibility to establish a reciprocity between and among the parties, the possibility to establish the procedure through which the agreement can be built and can be respected from the single actor's points of view. What are we? Who are and where are based the parties? So who are the actors, the agents, the recipients of the justice response? Then the spatial dimension, the boundaries of the demand of justice. So the state is enough, local communities are enough. I'm sure that together with the colleagues from the other curriculum, when we started speaking about green economy or circular economy, well, the local dimension or the spatial dimension is really important, is really at stake. Is that enough for framing a comprehensive issue about justice? The temporal dimension, then last and not least, the extent for the diachronic inclusion. I would focus in this slide on that point. So the temporal dimension in question, in order to establish or share some contents, and also to prepare and launch, in a sense, the contents that the colleague, Professor Andina, is going to share with you in a couple of minutes. The temporal dimension. Well, in political theory or in global ethics theory, we are used to have these three basic ideas of justice. So a theory of justice can be addressed towards the past, and in that case, we are used to talk about restorative or punitive justice, towards the present, and this is distributive justice, so distributed piece of cake, so slice of cake in a sense among the single actors or among the groups or among states and or among the first world and the other ones. Then we might speak about justice towards the future, and this is what we are used to call intergenerational justice. As soon as we enter into this realm, we are used to talk to deal with some problems, some theoretical problems. We don't have time, space, and resources enough to enter into details now, but just to mention a few of them. Well, as soon as we enter into the realm of intergenerational justice, we are transferring the very untraditional idea of justice, which is an horizontal line. So we have to share something among who is present right now. Now I see 106 people in this meeting. I will say, okay, I can be just, I can be fair if I try to distribute a certain amount of resources among we all according to certain principles or certain procedures that we can decide as the most fruitful ones. And this is just a very normal, I would say, not banal, but a traditional way for addressing issues of justice. But this issue is only established and articulated on the horizontal line. So the synchronic modalities for dealing with issues of justice. We have to imagine different plans, so different chronological status or different chronological levels. And this means that we have to face and to deal with an ontological problem, what is a generation. And this will be, by the way, exactly the problem that Tiziana Andina is going to address. We are going to have and to address a logical and procedural, the limits of any indirect reciprocity. Well, I can reciprocate with the colleague Eugenia Machiavello because she's here, is beside me, but I'm able to share something with who is not present in that conference and will be not present at all. An ethical problem. How is the stability of the moral and political will related to intergenerational justice? Last but not least, a political problem. Who ensures its implementations and control? Stopping with the legal problem, which is the status of the legal obligation towards future generations. This will be perhaps, I'm sure, the topic of our colleagues in the next slot. And I would like to conclude just to say that from distributive justice to intergenerational justice, we have a non-linear path to our comprehension, and we are used to focus on our horizontal line, and this is the most, let's say, logical / ontological mental gap that our politicians will have and are used to deal with. Justice and responsibility then is one of the key focus for our research, and this is a way to which we can address this systemic issue by contemplating the others, the role of the state, as our reference community, but up to come to the individual perspective. Am I personally responsible? Can I do or play a specific role in all those issues? That's the problem that we, as a moral and political philosophy, are trying to launch and to address, and that's the problem that we, together with other colleagues, are trying to address in our curriculum as for the philosophical part. But this is not all, and I'm going to leave the floor to the colleague, Professor Tiziana Andina, who is here beside me. Thanks indeed for your attention.
Thank you, Alberto. Can you hear me properly? Yeah, great. I try to share my screen. Okay. Okay, great. Thank you, Alberto, for this very complete and I also think clear introduction, especially the last part with the last 2 or 3 slides are very useful to me because those that part of your presentation introduced very well the way in which philosophy try to face the question of intergenerationality, which is the topic which I try to introduce briefly in this part of my speech. As Alberto probably explained in the final part of his presentation, philosophy is now trying to reconfigure, I would say, or rethink an important part of reality in order to face the question which has a lot of dimension of intergenerationality. By the way, in the slide you can read the terms transgenerationality, which I use more or less in the same way in which Alberto used intergenerationality. In the literature we can find both terms. So I prefer transgenerationality because these terms refers to different generation, but also to those generations which don't have any relation during the time, but you can find both terms. So a lot of different parts of philosophy try to face the question of intergenerationality because, like Alberto explained, it's intergenerationality or transgenerationality open a problem in a series of questions in ethics and moral philosophy, in ontology and metaphysics, and this is the approach I will try to follow in my speech, but also in political philosophy and probably also in philosophy and languages. So we need the full instruments of philosophy in order to explain why transgenerationality is important, and in order also to renew the way in which philosophy can help to rephrase and rethink reality, putting the notion of transgenerationality at the center of the philosophical investigation. So in my speech, I try to do 2 or 3 things, not more, and 2 of them as a relation with one of the mission of philosophy, which is try to clarify concept and notion. So I try to explain the notion of transgenerationality, and I try to explain how and what is transgenerationality. So I try to define the notion, which is one of the one of the jobs that philosophers usually try to do, and I try to explain how we can define transgenerationality. I try to put the focus on the notion of future generation, which was the notion which has been introduced by Alberto in the previous part of the of our talk. The notion of future generation is a central notion in ontology and metaphysics in order to construct a model of intergenerationality. So it's necessary to explain what is a generation for at least in the philosophical context, and how we can define a generation. So again, the question of definition is important to be addressed here. And I try to mention a particular kind of social action, which is usually discussed and introduced by social ontologists and social philosophers in general, and which is peculiar in some sense for those philosophers who try to reflect on transgenerationality. This particular kind of action is called transgenerational action. What they are, what are the transgenerational action, and why, I try to address this point, why they are important for philosophy. So what about transgenerationality? To explain the fact that society endures over the time, this is exactly the point which has been stressed by Alberto. For philosophers, is not only important to explain the way in which society work over the space, but is also important to explain how is possible that society endure over the time. So the question of the temporality is central here. To explain the fact that society endure over the time, the social ontology includes among its tools of analysis the concept of transgenerationality. We also, as philosophers, propose that we consider transgenerationality as a constraint that manifests itself in different forms. So we have two different types of transgenerationality. One of this type is more biological, has a biological aspect, I would say, and the other is social. So is something we have to understand from the social point of view. I want just to mention also the first type, the biological link between person and generation, in order to explain better the second type. Just to mention briefly the biological transgenerationality. Biological transgenerationality is that instinct that links parent to children. So it's very easy to understand what the philosopher and also psychologists mention here. We can easily detect biological transgenerationality as an instinct of protection and care that emerges within the family. So the link between parents and so on is the primary transgenerationality that is protected in almost all legal systems, including at the legislative level. So it's something that we know very easily, and in our common sense understand very easily what we intend when we refer to biological transgenerationality. A particular mode of emergence of primary transgenerationality is trauma, that is a trace that the transgenerational bond leaves behind when one of the bearers of the bond itself has failed due to unforeseen and unpredictable causes. This type of trauma is described very well by a lot of artists. For example, you can read the letter or the reflection which has been wrote by Salvatore Dali, who described very well this particular phenomena, which is described also by psychologists, like the replacement child, the situation in which one brother is died and the other, which born very closely to the first, feel a sort of negative feeling related to the connection, to the loss of the first brother. This is just a quotation by Dali. I experienced that before leaving life. My brother died 3 years before I was born. His death plunged my father and my mother into the depth of despair, and in my mother's belly I already felt their anguish. My fetus warm in Achilles' placenta. I felt deep the persistence of this presence, a kind of depth of affection. This dead brother, whose ghost welcomed me, was not by chance that he was named Salvatore, the same name of the painter. Like my father and like me, I learned to live by filling the gap of the affection which was not really given to me. And this is I repeat, a sort of experience, a very impressive experience, which was described by a lot of artists in the same situation. This is the first kind of transgenerationality, the bond between a person who live in the same family. We have another, and we experience it, we can describe another kind of transgenerationality, which is a social important and the social aspect. And this is the second kind of transgenerationality, which is important for our dimension and our analysis. The philosopher named this second type of transgenerationality as social transgenerationality, not biological, but the social one. Unlike biological transgenerationality, social transgenerationality is a bond that emerges in a series of social and institutional practices, specifically in a certain type of social action, namely what the philosopher called transgenerational social action. The transgenerational social action have the characteristic of requiring necessary cooperation. I would like to stress and underline this part of the definition. A necessary cooperation between at least two different generations which are posed in a different part of time and that can have no relation between them. One of the two decides to carry out the action that has a transgenerational character, while the second has the task of continuing and possible concluding the transgenerational action. So in this model, you have two different generations which occupy two different parts of the time, one a T1 and the other which is which plays a different part in the line of time, for example, T2. And in this model, you have the two different generations. We have to cooperate necessary in order to conclude a particular social action. The central theoretical point of transgenerational social action lies in the fact that the succeeding generation that complete the transgenerational social action generally do not have the opportunity to give prior consent to the action. Just one generation decide that a particular social action must be implemented in the course of the social practices. The critical point of transgenerational social action is that the generation deciding on transgenerational action cannot require others, in most cases future generation, to agree to the action. Material impossibility, however, does not exclude from an ethical point of view, this is the importance of the topics which has been stressed by Alberto before, of view this type of action, if undertaken, should not include the adoption of special precaution towards future generation. So we have a metaphysical model, an ontological model, a specific structure of social action, which must include a specific way of agencies between generation, which can have, or that can have a specific, that can open specific ethical and ethical question, ethical issue. What we can say about future generation, this is the second point of the clarification that I would like to do in this presentation, or of the concept clarification. What philosopher can say about future generation? I would say, I would try to consider future generation like a sort of abstract artifact in the way I can explain now. Since the notion of transgenerational social action refers in many circumstances to the concept of a future generation, it is necessary to make an ontological commitment to determine what kind of entity we are talking about when we refer to future generation. In other words, it's not possible for a philosopher to talk about an entity or to introduce an entity between his tool without taking a commitment on the ontological side towards that entity. So in other words, we have to explain what we mean referring to that entity. I propose to consider future generation as somewhat peculiar abstract artifact, as I mentioned before. At a certain stage of their existence, they have the same characteristic as, for example, Donald Duck, and more generally as fictitious entities or fictional entities. Yet, unlike Donald Duck, future generation are entities that will exist soon or later. In other words, they change their ontological status, turning it from the status of potential being to status of actual being. This means that they have the characteristic of moving from power to act, something which exists as a potential entity to something which more before or later will exist as an actual entity. The idea is that We have introduced this kind of entity into social reality, more or less clearly, precisely in order to exploit this shift from power to action. The expectation is created that future generations will enter into the dynamics of transgenerational action by continuing the action and concluding it. So in other words, we need future generation in order to explain a great part of social action, an important part of that social action which are performed by institutions or states, for example. So we as social actors have introduced the notion of future generation intentionally. This is the point. In other words, psychological mechanisms are set in motion at the social level, using trust as an instrument to regulate social dynamics. Without the future generation, it would be impossible to construct a mechanism of trust in performing some particular kinds of social action. To summarize, transgenerational action allows society, as we have structured them, to have a considerable, potentially infinite duration in time. They imply the existence of a specific dependencies constraint between the agent performing this type of action. This constraint is real and must be included in our ontologies. So it's something that we as philosophers have to recognize. Transgenerational social action are generally carried out by institutions, mostly governments and states, but can also be carried out by individuals acting on behalf of an institution or in person. The fact that we include the transgenerational social bond in our ontology also entails a consequent and necessary ethical acknowledgement. If the transgenerational bond exists and if the generation using it can enjoy certain favorable conditions, especially in terms of trust, which they would not otherwise enjoy, then we must also conclude that the present generation do not only have rights towards future generation. Duty towards them must be articulated and taken care of. So this is a sort of provisional definition in order to close our circle, theoretical circle of transgenerational action. We can define transgenerational action as those actions that require a necessary cooperation between two or more different generations, one of which is usually a future generation, to complete the action. The other point is important to remember is that just in this model, only one generation give the consent to the action, not all the generation involved in the social action. And this is just a point for your reflection. We will try to enter in the detail of the slides in the specific lesson as a curriculum will do probably in May. Which kind of action, which type of action are particularly relevant for the application of the model of transgenerationality, or which kind of action we can be explained, especially with the model I try to present to you today. In my opinion, especially this type of, so to say, social action or social problem that can be converted in social action, public debt, welfare states in general, and all those measure, action, and decision we have usually in the climate change problem. That's all, Alberto, on my side.
Thanks indeed, Tiziana. And so we completed a first, let's say, circle devoted to our disciplines and to the way to which we as philosophers, we try to address the topics devoted to climate change. But this is not all, of course, and we are used to think that all what is surrounding us is part of nature, and all what is surrounding us is part of an element which is given for granted. This is not so, and this will be the topic of our colleague, Professor Marco Fasoli, which is going to take the floor. So by addressing the way to which we can, again, deal with nature and deal with technological transformation of it, that implies a certain kind of consequences. Marco, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Pirni and Professor Andina. Can you hear me? Okay, I'll try to share my screen. Okay, so the title of my talk is Rethinking the Relationship Between Nature and Technology. And often the concept of sustainability is considered as connected in some way to the environmental protection, that means to the protection of nature, of course. This seems quite reasonable, in as much human intervention on nature has been very invasive in the last years, particularly in the last years. And in this perspective, nature often means that portion of the world that is separate from the human or from the human society. So we often think as nature as something that is clearly distinct and maybe also independent from humans, artifacts, and technology. On the one side, we have technological artifacts, and on the other, natural objects. And this is quite intuitive in our world. The purpose of my the purpose of my presentation is to convince you in a few minutes that this distinction is problematic and that new generations need to rethink it profoundly. And I will address specifically thesis that has been developed by Stephen Vogel, and it is a very provocative thesis. I'm not sure that it is a good solutions, but I think that the important point is the challenge that new generations are going to address. So, for instance, according to Vogel, the ambiguity of the concept of nature has been repeatedly noted by those who have written about it. Perhaps it is time to admit that the concept is too ambiguous, too confusing, too likely to issue in autonomous, perhaps even too intellectually seductive, to be helpful in discussions of how human beings ought best to live in the world. So why, according to Vogel, the notion of nature is so problematic? So consider, for instance, the spider's web. This is an object produced for a certain function, and in this it is very similar to human artifacts, although it is probably constructed automatically and unintentionally by spiders. Moreover, it is very complex. It is a very complex object. For instance, according to Tripaldi, if one had to choose an exemplary material, a sort of prototype to be entrusted with the responsibility of pointing the way forward in designing the materials of the future, spider silk would certainly be in the third place. So the surprising ability of silk to adapt its mechanical response to the stimuli it receives can, in short, be interpreted as the result of its structure, with its partly rigid and partly amorphous molecular composition, partly crystalline and partly disorderly. Silk is exactly neither a solid nor a liquid, but a material with hybrid characteristics. However, so the spider's web is very interesting from different perspectives. However, we may also hesitate to attribute intention to the spiders, mainly given the instinctive and rigid nature of their web-weaving behavior, and consequently, it seems that seems reasonable not to consider them the status of artifacts, because usually artifacts, technological artifacts, are intentionally built by someone. However, let's look at another example. Beavers, on the other hand, might be thought to intentionally construct dams in order to create ponds. And this because dams are probably more difficult to be built, and the process is more complex and need to be more flexible and to adapt to specific situations. If we compare dams with webs, for instance. So in a sense, beavers dams seems to qualify as technological artifacts, but paradoxically, they are created by animals that, and they don't pertain to the human realm. And so they are quite problematic with respect to the distinction between nature and technology, for instance. Another interesting example is the example of leeches that have been used since antiquity to let blood from patients. Of course, today this is a little disgusting, but the interesting point is, in my view, is that they were exploited, attributing them a specific function and treating them as artifacts and not as proper natural objects. Finally, another interesting case, another interesting problematic case is the case of biological artifacts. Domesticated plants and animals, for the most part, have both biological and cultural functions. Consider, for instance, seedless grapes. According to Sperber, for instance, their seedlessness might seem to make them purely artifactual, and since the reproductive function of a fruit appears to be lost along with the seeds. However, the seedless grapes, in a sense, retains the biological function of attracting us to eat the fruit and then spread the plant, not by dispersing the seeds, as with seeded grapes, but by propagating the grapevines vegetatively. So, in this case, this coincidence of biological and cultural functions in domesticates shows that far from being the locus of divide between nature and culture, the realm of domestication is the locus of their imperceptible merger. To sum up, we see that animals sometimes produce objects that are difficult not to consider as artifacts, which is quite paradoxical. While in other contexts, it is man who uses and exploits the animal world as if it were a technical artifact. And finally, in the case of biological artifacts, the biological and the technological functions in some way coincide. Another interesting point, which is stressed by Vogel, is that often nature means that portion of a world that is separate from the human and from the human society, as I mentioned before. But an interesting question in this perspective is how could humans have come to the special ability to tear things out of their natural state? After all, aren't humans themselves natural? Asks Vogel. And in a Darwinian perspective, this is quite obvious. We are inside the natural, we have evolved with nature. So we have to think why and how we are capable of transform natural things in something ontologically strongly different. So the paradox here is that humans are doubtless a part of nature, but still they are capable of ending nature also. And according to Vogel, this is one more reason for thinking that no good sense can be made of the artifact-nature distinction, making it unfit for the purposes of environmental philosophy, for instance. So, Stephen Vogel argues that no good sense can be made of an artifact-nature distinction. And this is because our concept of nature is riddled with antonymy-generating ambiguities. And so the provocative thesis that Stephen Vogel develops in his book, Thinking Like a Mole, is that we need to abandon the distinction between natural and artificial objects and think in terms of environments and its parts. So in this perspective, we are part of environment, and also technological artifacts are part of this environment. And then, according to Vogel, the environmental thinking would be better off if it drops the concept of nature and spoke instead of environment. That, according to him, is the world that surrounds us with its part. And in this sense, the title of the book is is provocative, and it is a reference to the motto of Aldo Leopold, who suggested that we should think like a mountain. Instead, according to Vogel, we have to think like a mole, because also moles are, in a sense, part of our environment. So the questions that Vogel addresses are: can we develop an environmental ethic and an environmental philosophy that take the environment, a word that simply means what surrounds us, to be built one we actually inhabit, and no longer concerns themselves with nature at all? By offering what might be called a critic of nature, I will try to argue such a philosophy may in fact we can read the, okay. By offering what might be called a critic of nature, I will try to argue such a philosophy may in fact show those form or older both older forms of environmental thinking to be associated with a worldview and a social order that are themselves complicit in the environmental horrors of today and of the future. So, to sum up, the distinction between natural and technological artifacts is, of course, very problematic. And Vogel's thesis is obviously provocative and difficult to be put into practice. But it should at least prompt us to reflect on the fact that technological artifacts are also composed of molecules and elements that are, in a sense, natural. So considering artifacts as being of a different nature presupposes the ability to place ourselves as humans outside the domain of nature. But this makes no sense if we consider that from a Darwinian perspective, man has belonged to nature. And this, in my view, resurfaces very strongly when artifacts stops being used and they become wasted. The fact that they are very difficult to dispose of shows us that they have been conceived not as natural objects, or in Vogel's terms, not as part that can be easily integrated with an environment. So the proposal of Vogel to abandon the notion of nature is quite complicated, maybe, but it should push us to think, and it should push us to reflect on how new generations should conceive the distinction that is so problematic in an environmental and sustainable perspective. And that's all. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks indeed, Marco, and thanks for your interesting presentation. We can move on to the next speakers. we agreed with Professor Mantoan to deliver his intervention immediately. Please apologize if I will be in charge for sharing his slide, and he will present his intervention by guiding me in that exercise.
Yes. Thank you very much. And sorry for the mask, but I am in a place where I cannot take it off. It's been quite an emergency situation, but everything's fine. So I think, as you will see now, what I am going to present really is kind of a photo gallery. So we are now going over to, let's call them artifactual artifacts. So this is really how artists in different generations, as we have been speaking of generations, as different generations of artists have reacted to climate change in general, to the climate crisis, or to environmental issues. So please, next slide. And you will see here something that I think looks quite bad if we are seeing this in our perspective today with our environmental and ecologist attitude that we have today. So today is 2022. Over 50 years ago, one of the fathers of so-called land art, or also earthworks, they have been called, or environmental art, Robert Smithson, would do a work like this, like the one you can see, which exactly does what the title says. It is a glue pour. So he loaded a barrel of glue into the environment. This doesn't look good today. This makes you, of course, think of oil being spilled over, of ecological disasters. But 50 years ago, such kind of picture is actually referring to something completely different. It would have been seen as a liberation from art institutions, art being brought outside of the museum into the environment, responding to the environment. But of course, this is something that impacts the environment. On the next slide, please, you will see another founder of the earthworks movement. Please, Professor Pirni, if you may go over to the next slide. And this is Michael Heitzer, the double negative, where he cut across a natural landmark. Okay, so just to make a minimalist point, really. But of course, in our eyes today, this is much more akin to the construction industry that severely impacts and changes the environment. But at the time, again, it's over 50 years ago, this would be called even environmental art. So the important thing here is that we have to change our mind and also the terms we are using in art history to describe the kind of changing attitude that came generation after generation towards the environment. But already in the next slide, please, you can see that already in the 1970s, when environmentalist movements really started to take off, also in the art world, started to come in the foreground some artists like John Latham that were working on the environment, but not yet again in this kind of exploitative, patriarchal, colonialist way. Here in Scotland, the five sisters, these that you can see, he pictured them, he photographed them, he made kind of an ethnographic and environmental research on these hills. These 5 hills are not natural hills. These 5 hills are actually debris. They are the residue of mining industry in Scotland. So this is how mankind has altered the landscape. And John Latham in the 1970s, with his artist placement group, decided that it was about time that in a creative way, humankind responded to what they had done to the environment. And here what he actually did, and it was not just a research about these hills, picturing them, but especially giving them a name. Christening the hills is a very important act because it gives people responsibility towards what they have done. So it's not just a hill of garbage, it has a name, and we have to respond to this. On the next slide, you will see another pioneer of environmentalist attitude that responded especially to leftovers of our industrial society, Nancy Holt, who interestingly was the wife of Robert Smithson, but she reacted in a completely different manner towards the environment. And here in Dark Star Park in Rosslyn, Virginia, she operated very often on abandoned landmarks inside urban areas, transforming them not just into parks, because that's something that a city mayor would do. No, she decided to give these places a new nature, especially to give them a cosmological relevance. So she tried to build cosmological oriented parks or gardens or landmarks in order to connect people again with their surrounding environment and even with outer space. So understanding that it's not just about turning landfills into parks, but giving them a meaning. On the next slide, on the next two actually, you will see another attitude. This is the very famous 7,000 Eichen, 7,000 Oaks by Joseph Beuys. There was, again, not in the 70s, it started in 1982, which also speaks of generations, because as the art historians know, what we can see here is another step. It's not just the artist reacting alone to the problems of the environment or giving responses to society, but here Joseph Beuys started to involve the public, to engage the audience. What he did at Documenta in Kassel, one of the most important international art exhibitions, was bringing, you can see here, 7,000 small pieces of stone that he would just disperse on the park in front of the museum. Of course, the citizens went very angry, but what was the pact that he tried to steer in the public? It was, and we can see it in the next picture, in the next slide, was that he would remove these stones from the park in front of the museum only for one oak, for one tree that was planted in the wider area of the city of Kassel. And in the next slide, you can see Joseph Beuys with his distinctive hat planting one of the trees. And it's interesting, it is very interesting that, I mean, we know planting trees has become almost a trend now, because that's how reforesting is of course one of the most important activities to fight climate change. But it started really with a symbolic action by Joseph Beuys. And speaking of generations, it's interesting that he didn't see the end of this project. It was meant to end in 5 years, so exactly the time spent between one exhibition and the other Documenta exhibition, but he died 1 year before. But the trees still grow in Kassel, and they grow also in other parts of the world where this action has been brought by other activists inspired by Joseph Beuys. On the next slide, again, you can see again these sort of participatory works like Betsy Damon, and we are in the 1980s. So the 1980s really started to have artists foster these kind of participatory works where it was important to engage people. Betsy Damon, A Memory of Clean Water, 1985, she made a paper cast of a riverbed that didn't exist anymore because of rising temperatures already in the 1980s. So see how quickly artists reacted to the signs in the environment that something was going wrong. On the next slide, we're now jumping a few decades, 2 decades, but after Hurricane Katrina in 2004, and the tsunami in 2004 and Hurricane Katrina in 2005, especially in North America, there has been a spate of exhibitions explicitly devoted to climate change. And of course, we all remember 2007, An Inconvenient Truth, documentary film by Al Gore, which then earned him a Nobel Prize. And in fact, in North America, one can count over a dozen exhibitions in those years concerned with climate change. And what's interesting is that most of the artists involved were not the very famous artists, the one of the elite art world, but those that we really can call activist artists, especially public artists that wanted to engage the wider audience on environmental problems. This is Mary Miss, Connect the Dots in Boulder Creek, a very important exhibition because it was curated by Lucy Lippard, that art historians know very well because she was one of the main protagonists of art feminism in the 1970s. So she turned to ecological issues. And Mary Miss here with these dots is signing in the city of Boulder, where she's signposting where the water level could rise in case of a disruption caused by climate change. So they're bringing their instances, artists are becoming activists inside society, and they're bringing their instances inside society. They're trying to engage the public, not just the art public, and this is one of the most important things, but it's trying to build a dialogue between science, technology, and humankind in order to change their behavior, their attitudes towards nature. On the next few slides, we can go also quite quickly because I see it's probably too long. Gail Chong-Kwan, an Asian artist based in London, Paris Remains. She's collecting leftovers of food here in Paris to reconstruct Gothic architectures that speak of what is being disposed of by our eating disorders, I would say, in our cities. And this is 2008. And then again, next slide, just to present some of the very interesting works, like this one by Tiga Brain, an Australian artist based now in New York, coin-operated laundry. She's also an engineer, and this is also interesting. So we start again having artists that are using the creative languages together with science to bring creative solutions that could inspire new visions in our behavior towards the environment. Coin-operated laundry is a very simple and clever artifact. It is a common laundry as you would have in every basement from New York to Los Angeles, but these ones work in a way that the water, that the sewage that goes out of the washing machine is being immediately filtered by a wetland grown in that place. And so the wetland cleans the water, and the water gets back again in a virtuous circle into the washing machines. And this installation piece is going to be shown also at the exhibited at the Smithsonian Gallery later this year. So I think I can even stop here. What I wanted to make as a point is that artists have come increasingly became activists, increasingly started to try engage the wider public, increasingly tried to propose creative solutions that could change cultural paradigms, recognizing that it is the way we think that prevents very often an effective action towards the environment. And it's interesting also, one of the next slides, but it's, I think, not the next, but please, Alberto, just skip a few slides. Let's see the next one, just to end. And then perhaps another one too. Because these artists started also to become very active on the occasions of the COP. Next one, please. This is Vinci Gallesi. They saved a natural landscape being turned into a landfill. And this is Tiziana Pers liberating squids from the fish market. And then again, please. And this,
Eccoci qua.
Ecco qua. Yeah, no, okay. So please.
Alberto, your microphone is open.
You want to switch your microphone off.
I would say this is it then, really. Thank you very much. Sorry, it was a little longer than expected. And this was just to show what the artists did over the years.
Okay, thanks indeed, Diego. Thanks for your intervention and also for having letting you know this entire and complex history of ideas and history of the way to which the artist became also an activist and became a point of reference for the contemporary debate related to climate change and its transformations. It's not the turn of Professor Paola Spinozzi, who is going to go deeper and deeper into the way to which literary forms or artistic forms developed the same rationale, shaped those in their own terms, and demonstrated at every point several other points of novelty related to the same.
Can you confirm? Can you confirm you can hear me?
Perfectly, Paola. Perfectly.
Good. I know that time is an issue. Time is always of the essence, and time is an issue today. I think we have to be a little bit patient because we are late. There's no denying that we are late, and I think that we have to try and be a little bit patient because, there will be questions and answers, but there's also this presentation of mine, which I can try and shrink as much as possible, but the point is we're supposed to be finished by 1, and I can already anticipate we will not be finished by 1. So let's try and be patient. If I may say this, just as an encouragement, as an invitation to join the day as it goes. So I hope you can you see my screen?
Yes, we can, Paola. Perfectly, Paola.
Yeah, okay, yeah, I was trying. Can you see my screen as a presentation now? Presentation mode, is it working?
Yes, it's working.
Good. So I will try and be as concise as possible, talking about the humanities and the environment. From a theoretical and methodological point of view, we have two main questions, two main issues here. One is what the ecological humanities can do to sustain the environment, and what eco-criticism can do to sustain the environment. And there are two different perspectives, what the ecological humanities are and what eco-criticism is and what they can do. So to try and explain, to try and summarize what they can do, I would start by saying that humanities scholars are usually associated to ways of interpreting the world rather than to ways of acting in the world. The humanities and the environment should try and change that. In fact, they have tried to change that. They are changing that. It's a process, and they are changing that in ways that allow humanities scholars to still propose interpretations while at the same time trying and exploring forms and ways of active commitment. So it's a case of trying to bring together interpretations, hermeneutic models, epistemological models, along with commitment and agency. This brings me to the next issue and to the next answer that I would like to share with you. What ecological humanities can do to sustain the environment, to discuss, to retrace the origins of ecological thinking, of how ecological minds were formed, have developed throughout the centuries. And this also involves stressing the importance of a diachronic approach and of a historical approach. And then assess what the ecological humanities have achieved until now, even before they were known as ecological humanities, and of course plan what we should aim to achieve. Well, we got lucky because we as a group, and certainly the national PhD program, but even more so, we as a group, we as a CV are the ecological humanities. The ecological humanities are formed by a variety, a wide range of humanistic disciplines, and certainly our curriculum is representative of that: philosophy, sociology, anthropology, literature, the law. So I would say that we are becoming a model. Hopefully we're becoming a good model of the ecological humanities. While eco-criticism is in fact what I do as a literary scholar. And what eco-critics do, they try and understand how literature and literary study can become more militant, while at the same time staying true to the autotelic nature of art and literature. And it's a difficult job. It doesn't seem to be so difficult, but as a matter of fact, it is quite tough. And I have had objections from colleagues of mine, literary scholars, who have told me, why do we have to do that? Cannot we go on appreciating, enjoying, understanding the aesthetic value of text, of literary text, of poetry, of theatre? No, as a matter of fact, we cannot only do that. We can certainly do that, but we can no longer only do that. So the ecological humanities can help people understand, all of us understand, how important history and stories are. History, because history provides a background. History puts things and phenomena in perspective, but also stories, the importance of stories, the importance of narratives, and the importance of storytelling. While one of the reasons why we have failed so far, we have failed up to now, is that we have relied on scientific discourses, we have relied on scientific data, which are certainly essential. I'm not at all trying to disparage or diminish the importance of these contributions. I'm trying to say I really want to say, not trying to say, I want to make clear, it's very forceful, this idea of mine, is that scientific data and measurements acquire validity and acquire meaningfulness if they go together with other approaches that involve, as I said, history, a historical approach, and highlight the importance of stories, because we need scientific data as much as we need stories that we can relate to. Otherwise, those scientific protocols, agendas like COP26, they seem very far away, they seem very remote. And in the end, we end up not really caring. I want to give you three very, very quick examples of what I mean. And the first example, of course, is the very famous Rachel Carson, Silent Spring, A Fable for Tomorrow. And I'm quoting her, I'm not going to read the whole passage, but of course this presentation will be available for you. What I'm trying to say is that, let me move the bar. You see what I've highlighted in bold, that this is a book on synthetic pesticides and how these synthetic pesticides are biocides. They affect not only pests, but the whole ecosystem. But at the same time, while this book is a book on environmental sciences, because Rachel Carson was an environmental scientist, it's also a book on the narrativization of science. It's also a book that merges environmental science with fairy tale and fable, fable in the etymological sense of the term, a story that has a didactic meaning. It also merges pastoral and the apocalypse. And this is why this specific book that has been able to do this has sparked off environmentalism. Another example is Lynn White Jr., The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis. Lynn White is a medievalist, is a professor of medieval history. And in 1967, he published this essay, which is still fundamental. And the point that White is making as a medievalist is that it is essential to interrogate the history of Western thought and understand how and why the Christian paradigm has taught us, has suggested that we should consider nature as something, as an entity at the service of man. So this is why I'm saying that we need history, without which we do not understand why we are where we are now. And the last example is Bateson, the last example of a relevant contribution to the ecological humanities. Bateson, very famous, Gregory Bateson, who wrote Steps to an Ecology of Mind. And this, in fact, I would like to read a little bit because it's very good in narrative terms. It is of no use to plead that a particular sin of pollution or exploitation was only a little one, or that it was unintentional, or that it was committed with the best intentions, or that, quote, if I didn't, somebody else would have, end of quote. The processes of ecology are not mocked. On the other hand, surely the mountain lion, when he kills the deer, is not acting to protect the grass from overgrazing. In fact, the problem of how to transmit our ecological reasoning to those whom we wish to influence in what seems to us to be an ecological good direction is itself an ecological problem. We're not outside the ecology for which we plan. We are always and inevitably part of it. And you see how in bold I highlight the narrative quality of this excerpt and also the metacritical attitude. So not only the ability to express a critical attitude, but also, and more importantly, to ask, to wonder how that attitude, that methodology works. So to ask ourselves how we do what we do. Worcester also provided I would say a map, a road map for all of us. And it's an appeal to humanities scholars. It's an encouragement to do what we do best, produce interpretations that are based on facts, but also on value judgments. So Worcester and others, and very good scholars in the ecological humanities have highlighted the importance of value judgments, of immaterial as much as material, intangible as much as tangible components. So these courses have to have both, not only material, tangible and objective, but also immaterial and intangible and subjective components. Eco-criticism, what eco-criticism can do to sustain the environment. Well, eco-critics study how poetry, prose, and drama tackle ecological topics and how they do this by generating epistemological meaning, epistemological contributions, while at the same time being able to appreciate the aesthetic value of works of art, because that remains fundamental. Otherwise, works of art will become something else. And in bold, you can see environmental crisis. This is what literary criticism does. Literary criticism focusing on the environment does is to see how environmental crisis concurrently inspire stories, engender knowledge, and produce agency. I don't have time to talk about this, but again, it's in the presentation. I'm quoting other important definitions of eco-criticism by influential scholars. We're talking about the end of the 1990s.
Professor Spinozzi, we'll still see the same slide.
Really?
Rachel Carson. Yes. Apologies.
Oh no, apologies all mine. So you've gone on seeing the very same. What about now?
Okay. Now is the previous one.
I'm very sorry. Yeah.
That's the Carson one.
Okay. No.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Now it's moving. Is it moving now?
Yes.
Yes. Good. I'm very sorry. I thought everything was all right. And thank you for drawing my attention to the stuck situation. Thank you so much. So I'm scrolling the slides, which I'm afraid you will have to go back to in the presentation. It's a pity it didn't work. It didn't work as a presentation. It just works like this, but it's okay. It often happens. So this is a slide on eco-poetry, why eco-poetry is important, and how eco-poetry has started looking into the pastoral genre and has gone through romantic and late romantic poetry, and then has generated new ways of writing poetry in the contemporary age. So when we talk about eco-poetry, again, we have to acquire a long-term perspective that goes back to the origins of Western civilization. Of course, I'm talking about Western civilization, not because it is more important, but just because it is the culture that we are referring to right now. When we talk about pastoral, pastoral has and takes on very different meanings in different cultures. Fiction, environmental fiction, so eco-criticism, as I said, explores literature, so explores all the genres in literature that deal with the environment and with ecological problems. Fiction does this, and I would say that the main core of environmental fiction is to question our humanity, question how our humanity, when our humanity is being challenged by endangered futures, climate endangered futures. So how we're going to cope with that? These are the questions that I've tried to point out. Is there a way out? If not, shall we hope that the way out will be found eventually? So how can we cope with environmentally doomed future? By maintaining our humanity, if we can, and of course by encompassing other forms of living beings, not only humans, but other than human living beings. I would just use a very few minutes of my time to talk about newspapers and articles, because this issue came up in the chat. So I guess we will discuss this in the chat. And in fact, it was anticipated in the chat how we use certain words in certain ways, how we try and mitigate or change the tenor of the discourse by selecting certain words rather than others. And I want to share, so now I'm going to share something else, if I'm allowed to. Because at the moment, it looks as if new share, yes, new share, exactly. New share, and that's it, good. So COP26, one of the 3 articles that I mentioned, Document Leak reveals nations lobbying to change key climate report. I hope you can see it. You can see it, can you?
Yes.
Yes.
I would just like to draw your attention to captions here. one from the advisor, Saudi Oil Ministry. Phrases like the need for urgent and accelerated mitigation actions at all scales should be eliminated from the report. It's exactly the point that was raised in the chat. And more importantly here, senior scientist in the Central Institute of Mining and Fuel Research, coal is likely to remain the mainstay of energy production in the next few decades for sustainable economic growth of the country. Well, the contradiction is patent, is very evident here, right? That coal is to remain the mainstay of energy for sustainable economic growth, right? It's antithetical. It's very important that we really acquire, regardless of our background, regardless of whether we are engineers, mathematicians, architects, scholars, philosophers. That is not the point. The point is that we all have to acquire the ability to read through, to see through these discourses. And this is exactly the main problem with COP26. Also, Alberto pointed that out earlier, that a lot of time was employed, used, wasted on trying to change that noun, that adjective. This is exactly the point that we have to learn. And I hope this is just the first day for the curriculum, but I hope we learn, and you learn, how to do that, how to point out to ambiguities, to ambivalent messages in written or oral forms of communication. And I will finish by talking about, very briefly, clearly, by talking about two important campaigns that came out, one in 2009 and one in 2015, in The Guardian. So I will now share something else. Very quickly, I will share the. No, I can go back to my. It's easier and quicker. So these two campaigns, one is called 1010 Review Climate Change Special, came out in 2009, and the other one, Keep It in the Ground. It was curated by a very famous British poet, Carol Ann Duffy, and came out in 2015. So I have chosen two poems. I think I will certainly focus on one and then maybe talk about the other one in the discussion. This is 2084 by Carol Rumens. Pair wheels and PV panels, ponds and hives and garden fields, citron and silvery green sampler stitched by hand, declare our ground. We're scripture safe in our examined lives. For each estate, one bin, one fridge, one screen only. Daily rationing of downloads. That ice bar thrilling in the distant sound, that flood in motion inches from the crossroads, where we abolished runways and rewound the wine mills, will be measured and contained. The government says so, and the world will sail over the carbon peak, will be in free fall, the whole sweet way to paradise regained. It's low, of course. The children want to burn anything that burns. They say we stole the magic brand and scraped the sun's wheel to spark it. So shut up, it's their turn to hit the gas, light out, ignore the brakes, as children should. Just let us be children, that they wail from blazing consoles, and we'll tell them, or try to, what it was to drive that borrowed chariot, rocketing, spiraling with its florid machinery in a thunder of gold tires, down, down the yellowing skyways. Oh, infelix Beethan, earth grew nothing then by fires. We drove death into childhood just being children. And I would like to draw to your attention to just three things here. One, 2084, I'm sure that the reference to 1984 is evident to most of you, the dystopian representation by George Orwell. And also the reference to the myth, Phaethon. I'm sure that we are all, in the Western culture, of course, we are all familiar with Phaethon, the son of Apollo, who stole, who borrowed the chariot, the sun chariot, to his father, and then died in the attempt at riding the chariot, and he was unable to control the chariot, so he burned. And the third thing I want to point out and want to draw your attention to is, who are the children? So this is the question that I would like to share with you. Who are the children that want to burn anything that burns? The children, of course, are, and I won't say who they are, and I will leave this open for discussion. Thank you very much.
Paola, thanks indeed. Can you hear me, Paola?
Yes. Absolutely.
Okay. Thanks indeed for your brilliant presentation, and also for having, let's say, further enlarged the floor and the picture devoted to what we can do as scholars in humanities, in social sciences, and in philosophy. Now, we have a process sometimes for trying to answer. I noticed that some colleagues are already started answering to the issues in the chat. I don't know if we can go further by doing that, or since we are completely on time, since this is 1 p.m., we can also decide to update our conversation. I don't know if there are some issue for Professor Spinozzi. Spinozzi is here, Paola is here, and she can reply immediately. As for myself, I received some questions. I would like not to waste your time now, and I will try to answer in the next section, perhaps by using the chat again in order to save time now. The same, I imagine, will do the colleague Professor Mantoan, since he has to go now. Paola, if you see some points to which you would like to address some words, the floor is yours.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. I saw, if I may,
Sure.
a question that I found very interesting before. And that was a question, I have to go back and still back. Yes, Chiara Lanza, that raises the issue as to whether and why we should always revert to a view that focuses on humans, and how come we are still unable to think and reflect and speculate in wider terms. It is very true, Chiara, I totally agree that that is one of the main issues. Also, as you know, we talk about human and non-human. We've talked about human and non-human for a long time, and this is also changing, because this is how you refer to those who are not human. And we're talking about, now we're trying to talk about other than human, because of course, if you talk about non-human, the dichotomy is still there. Either you are human or you are non-human. And this is certainly a very challenging issue. I believe that at eco-criticism and ecological humanities are really trying hard to think in terms of interdependence, interconnectivity, and intersectionality. So I would say that these three terms are a good food for thought. Then Chiara also asked another question that is related to this one, the fact that the humanities are trying, but not so much, other disciplines, other sectors, not so much. Well, as you know, I'm sorry, but I have to mention this. As you know, there is a PhD program that is attached to this at the University of Ferrara, in which this attempt has been made for the last 2 years. And it's very difficult. And I'm sure that this new national PhD program that is much wider, much broader in its scope, can continue and in fact can enhance this, because it's the only way we can do this. And I certainly understand the reason why we have curricula, because curricula are helpful. They allow us to recognize each other, right? To recognize similarities. We are all different, even here, but we are less different than in other curricula. But at the same time, what I really believe is that we need hyper-disciplinary approaches. It's not inter, it's not trans, it's not multi, it is hyper, which means, and I've kept saying this for quite some time now, it means to be able to acquire other methodologies. It means to be able to acquire other theoretical frameworks, not because we are going to become different, we're going to turn into something else, we're going to shift our shapes. We're not shape shifters, but I would regard all of us as mutating, as scholars, as ecological minds that are mutating, incorporating, metabolizing, and absorbing other points of view. There are other questions, but I don't want to monopolize. So I guess that other scholars, other colleagues want to take part in the discussion.
Paolo, thanks. Thanks indeed. So far, at least so far, there are a lot of very stimulating questions. Let me ask if Professor Andino and Professor Fasoli would like to intervene. Well, they already replied in a sense, but if they want to have more time and space, the floor is yours, Tiziana.
No, in a sense, I try to reply to the question in a written form, suggesting also, I think, an excellent exchange of thought between Thomas Jefferson and Madison, who try to explain what is transgenerationality, but also why it is central in our constitutional model. So it's a great thing to exchange, to read from the philosophical and theoretical, but also juridical point of view, I think. So I suggest that reading in order to solve a lot of questions that I wrote in the chat.
Thanks indeed, Tiziana. Marco?
Yeah, it's the same for me. Thank you very much. But if you have other questions or suggestions, I'm here for you.
Sorry, Alberto, there is a question directly to me about the Great Derangement, if I may answer that question.
Absolutely.
A recent bestseller about the climate crisis is Gosh, The Great Derangement. It's recent, not so very recent, because it came out in 2016. And I'm saying that it's not totally recent because my idea is that his claim that, which you point out here, your claim that fiction production has not been able to react very promptly. And I remember Chiara Lanza raised the same issue in a previous event as to whether authors of in all genres, poets, playwrights, and novelists, whether they have been able to address the climate crisis issue promptly, and whether they have failed. Well, this was the case a few years ago, but I believe it's no longer the case. I believe that now things have changed, and I think that now awareness is being raised. I can see that plots have proliferated. So no, I wouldn't agree to that. I would agree that it was the case a few years ago, but 5 years in literary criticism, just like in every other sector, are a lot, and things have changed.
Thanks, thanks indeed, Paola. If I may then add a couple of words devoted to the issue that I received very few times. Well, in the meantime, following the example coming from other colleagues, I tried to copy and paste in these slides your very really interesting and triggering contributions. As to Elena Nalato, thanks indeed, Elena. Vaccination apartheid. Well, two levels. From a technical point of view, that apartheid didn't took place since well, not in terms of vaccine, but in terms of tests, they were distributed for granted, and the delegates were all vaccinated by the state from the technical point of view. But from an ethical and political point of view, you are completely right. The risk that we are occurring is that the weakest part of the world is occurring the risk of having the weakest time and access to the public voice. So this is really a research topic. So the nexus between weakness devoted to vaccination and weakness or additional weakness devoted to climate change migration, climate change difficulties of housing, or promoting one's own view for happiness, for wellness, is really a triggering research topic. And thanks for having raised it again. Also in those terms, I'm completely on your side.
Alberto, sorry, because we are, I think, almost over. Can I ask again, who are the children in the 2084 poem?
So, sorry, Paula, I was not able to ask.
Yeah, no, I wanted to readdress the question with which I finished my presentation. The poet, the eco-poet, Carol Rumens, she mentions children. Who are the children she refers to in that poem in 2084? That dystopian poem. This was a question that I left open, and I think that someone in the chat has already, I won't say who, but someone in the chat has already addressed that issue. So the question is, who are the children?
But this is a question that, are you referring to me or?
No, not you, Alberto. No,
it's for the students or for us.
For all of us,
Okay.
all of us.
Now it's clear. Sorry, because the audio was not completely understandable before.
So can I? I'm sorry, Alberto.
Yeah.
If you unshare your screen.
Okay, but just Paula, sorry, just to give an order and to conclude our point.
Yeah.
I would do that. So I reserve myself to answer to all people raising issues to me. Very interesting. Elena Nalato, Lydia Dahl, and then Chiara Lanza, Licinia Pascucci, and Barbara Frigione in the chat during the afternoon by copy and pasting their own questions and trying to reply in capsule forms. As for the other colleague, Marco already replied, and Professor Mantoano will be with us later on.
Yeah, or if you wish, I can also answer now, or just tell me if there's time.
Well, perhaps we can leave the floor to Paula in order to conclude, to let Paula conclude. Then perhaps we can update our conversation in the afternoon, since we are just a bit late, but we are substantially on time. Please, Paula, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. Well, I would like to hear from you. I would like to try some interactive activity. When here, you see, I don't know if you can see my cursor. It's low, of course. The children want to burn anything that burns. From here to the end, just let us be children that wail from blazing consoles, and we tell them, or try to, that it was to drive that borrowed, blah, blah. So who are the children?
This is an open question, right?
It is absolutely open. Yes, absolutely open.
So please, who would like to break the ice? I see messages, Paula.
Ah, sorry. Ooh, sorry about that. Oh, my goodness. Okay. I was thinking about the youth movement, like Extinction Rebellion or Fridays for the Future. Could it be the children, adults acting irresponsibly in the recent past? I think the children are every one of us. In fact, well, these questions, these answers are right in different ways, partially right in different ways. The children she's referring to are metaphorically developing countries. And it's one of our main issues, the fact that in the West, in Western countries, we have done all this. We have already caused so much damage, right? So much damage throughout the centuries. And now we are the ones who are saying, it's time to stop. Excuse me, now time is up. We cannot do this anymore. We have to reduce this, we have to cut that. But other countries have not experienced that. So we are asking them to not grow up, to not be able to grow, to, in a sense, to arrest their growth, because we have already done all the growing and seen where it gets us. But that, of course, is hugely controversial, because again, it's the Western anthropocentric view of the world that is supposed to lead the way. And because we have already not been able to lead the way, why should we now? And in fact, one of the, in the chat, there was one point that raised exactly this issue. Let me go up to the chat here. Sorry, where is it?
The last two messages, Paola, were coming from Elena Nalato, adults acting irresponsibly in the recent past.
Yes.
And
No,
19, the children, Luisa mentioned. I think the children are every one of us.
Yeah, but it was earlier. It was earlier. It was quite an answer to someone else. I'm checking the chat right now, and yes. No. Yes. Marco, yes. I believe it's more difficult to change in Western colonialist views, because if you look, for example, at different indigenous communities around the world, or for example, a South American country like Ecuador or Bolivia, they're even preserving nature and earth as legal entities in their constitution. This vision is completely different. Yes, it's exactly that point, that instead of saying, excuse me, now we are telling you what you should do, we should share and acquire other perspectives, other world views, which we have not until now. So in a nutshell, it's mostly, not only, but mostly a matter of culture and interculture in a very wide sense of the term.
Okay, Paola, culture and cultures means also the possibility to use and reuse different lands. And this morning we tried to share with the audience, with the other colleagues, and with our PhD students and candidates, a significant segment of the multi and transdisciplinarity of our curriculum. In the next part of the day, we are going to explore not less interesting, but again, very complex and large and multifaceted avenue, which will be the one embodied by the legal area and the sociological area. So I don't know if our coordinator, Professor Martina, would conclude in some ways, but from our side, I do think that we arrived at the end of the morning in a very satisfactory way. Thanks indeed to you all, first of all.
Thank you, Alberto. Nothing to add, and we'll meet again at 3 p.m. this afternoon. So have a nice break.
Thank you.
Thanks indeed.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye to you all.
Bye.
Bye to Intervention.